What is up, ladies and gentlemen? How are you? I hope you guys are good. I hope you guys are great. Hope you guys have had a good week. I know my week has been shitty as hell, but that's okay. I'll get over it. Or maybe I won't. I probably will. But anyway, we are. Title of this live stream is What Can We Do? Something? Nothing? Anything? Hi, Darlene. What's up? How are you, sweetheart? Hope you're doing good, sister. So I was reading this article here. It's kind of, I don't know about it. But it is from PMC PubMed Central from the National Library of Medicine. This was back in 2022. Humanizing Pedophilia as Stigma Reduction, a large-scale intervention study. The stigmatization of people with pedophilic sexual interests is a topic of growing academic and professional consideration. Owing to its potential role in moderating pedophiles' emotional well-being and motivation and engagement in child abuse prevention schemes, thus improving attitudes and reducing stigmatization towards this group is of paramount importance. Prior research has suggested that narrative humanization, presenting personal stories of self-identified non-offending pedophiles, could be one route to doing this. However, this work has only been conducted with students and trainee psychotherapists, meaning the public generalization ability of this method is still unknown. In this study, we compared two stigma interventions to test whether narratives reduce stigma towards people with pedophilic interests more effectively than an informative alternative, scientific information about pedophilia. Using a longitudinal experimental design with a lack of non-intervention control, initial n equals 950, final n equals 539, we found that narratives had consistently positive effects on all measured aspects of stigmatization, dangerousness, and intentionality, whereas an informative alternative had mixed results and actually increased perceptions of pedophiles' level of deviance. These effects were still present for 4 months after the initial presentation. We discussed these data in relation to ongoing debates about treating pedophilia as a public health issue requiring a broad societal approach to well-being and child abuse prevention. Introduction. I'm doing better. I'm doing all right. Thanks for asking. Many researchers have begun to explore sexual interests in children via sexual abuse prevention and well-being perspectives. I'm not going to read that. However, there is an acknowledgement within the literature that the effective treatment of individuals with such sexual interests is contingent on the availability of the willingness of professionals to work with this client group and the client group feeling comfortable in seeking support that is made available. As such, finding methods of effective stigma reduction is becoming an important topic of study in relation to this client group. In this paper, we asked whether previously observed effects of narrative, if previously observed effects of narrative humanization, the process by which stigma towards people with pedophilic sexual interests is reduced by presenting personal stories from the perspective of people within the community, are observable at a scale within a large community sample, and whether they are persistent over time. This is going to be hard for me to read all the way through. I'm just telling you right now. I'm not defending pedophilia, but that's what this is. Defending pedophilia. Pedophilia is defined as a persistent and recurrent sexual interest in prepubertal children. Further defines pedophilic disorder as a persistent sexual interest in prepubescent children, which manifests itself in thoughts, fantasies, urges, sexual arousal, or sexual behavior, and is accompanied by either acting on or experiencing distress because of this interest. Pedophilia is not synonymous with sexual offending against children, though it is often conflated with child sexual abuse in popular and academic discourses. Seto emphasized that most men who sexually abused children were not pedophiles, nor do all pedophiles sexually abuse children. Empirically, among child sexual abusers across multiple assessment approaches, a subgroup of between 20 and 50% can be classified as pedophilic. People claim they want it stopped, but they refuse to talk about it. Being silent helps it escalate. Yes, it does. Everyone speak out. Thanks. You're welcome. Let's continue on here, shall we? The common principle across multiple definitions of pedophilia is that it constitutes a stable sexual preference, independent of arousability, intensity of sexual feeling, or gender preference. Eilers and Schaefer proposed that human sexual preference should be described using three independent dimensions. The first dimension is sexual orientation, referring to sexual gender preferencing along the continuum of heterosexuality, bisexuality, homosexuality. The second dimension is sexual directedness, referring to age preference along a continuum of children, adolescents, and adults. The third dimension is sexual inclination, referring to preferences for specific characteristics in others or specific sexual activities. Hence, a person with pedophilic sexual interests might be described as showing either a heterosexual, bisexual, or homosexual orientation, depending on the sex of children preferred, with sexual directedness towards children and any form of sexual inclination. In this conceptualization, sexual preference is therefore differentiated from sexual drive, which is defined as the intensity and frequency of sexual feelings and motivations. Defining sexual preference is the comprehensive way. Defining sexual preference in this comprehensive way is important as having a sexual interest in children is an empirically supported risk factor for sexual recidivism. This means that when it is present, risk of offending is raised as sexual preference acts as an intrinsic motivator for sexual behavior. However, it is important to distinguish whether an individual is exclusively attracted to children or attracted to adults as well as children, as it appears that only preferential pedophilic interests is a risk factor for sexual recidivism in samples of men convicted of child sexual offenses. Yeah. Stigmatization of pedophilia. A number of researchers have recently begun to study the social stigmatization of people with sexual interests in minors. For example, a series of studies have examined how stigmatization of this population is reflected in cognitively oriented perceptions of the controllability and willful choice of having pedophilic sexual interests and attributions of psychopathic or predatory offending behavior. Stigmatizing attitudes may be related to the popular confliction between pedophilia and child sexual abuse. When asked about sex offenders, many are inclined to envision the media proliferated stereotypical image of a violent predatory male pedophile. And by extension, we might argue that when asked about pedophiles, many are inclined to envision a predatory child sex offender. This view is based in intuitive and heuristically based contingent that are bound up in availability and representativeness processes, whereby highly accessible causes of pedophiles committing sexual offenses are associated with particular behavioral and affective responses due to the use of the pedophile label with the mainstream media. At the core of the stigmatization, of people with pedophilic sexual interests may be mental processes related to dehumanization. Have a good one, brother.
Yeah, I'll see you guys in a little bit.
All right, man.
I think Dave's coming to get me, so.
All right.
All right, love you.
Thank you, brother. A number of research teams have examined dehumanization with the context of media representations of sexual crime, which is often dominated by offenses committed against children and subsequently conflicted with pedophilia. For example, Harper and Hogue reported how tabloid readers express more narrative negative attitudes towards people convicted of sexual offenders than do broadsheet readers. However, the only difference in how these types of newspapers reported on sexual crimes was in the headlines. Tabloids were more overtly hostile and dehumanizing in their descriptors of those convicted of sexual crimes, whereas broadsheets were more descriptive, typically using the crime type or the perpetrator's prior occupations. In addition to this work, Vicky E.T. Edel reported how the dehumanization of people convicted of sexual offenses by the public is associated with the lower levels of support for rehabilitation and reintegration and higher levels of support for punitive public policy. Within the professional context, dehumanization by clinicians was associated with lower ratings of therapeutic alliance, which is in turn predictive of worse therapeutic outcomes. The importance of addressing stigmatization. I don't really think there is. It is not only in social attitudes, public policy, and treatment settings that the stigmatization of people with pedophilic sexual interests has negative effects. According to Jankel, whatever the hell, pedophiles may self-stigmatize with this having profound effects on well-being. For instance, greater levels of perceived stigmatization operationalized as perceptions of negative views about pedophiles among the general population were associated with increased levels of fear related to being discovered or outed as a pedophile. Such contingencies may subsequently lead to thought and identity suppression. With such effective attempts at concealing one's identity being associated with a host of negative downstream effects for mental health. These issues are important as they have significant implications for public health from both a mental well-being and child abuse prevention perspective. From a well-being perspective, people with sexual interests in children have reported that professionals working with them appear to focus more on risk reduction, despite them preferring to be supported in relation to the more generalized psychological well-being issued mentioned above. This in turn leads many people with pedophilic sexual interests to be unwilling to come forward and access mental health support because of doubts over whether those professionals offering such services will act in non-judgmental ways. Indeed, evidence suggests that the stigma experienced by those who have a dominant sexual interest in children impairs help-seeking behaviors due to both perceived and anticipated rejection. Why wouldn't they be rejected? Instead, these individuals may seek out a range of online fora wherein they can communicate with and be supported by other non-offending people with pedophilic interests in a safe environment. It's fucking ridiculous. The scale of the use of these fora suggests that the level of supply of services may be far lower than the demand for them. In identifying such a need to address stigma to improve both, one, general levels of well-being among MAPS, minor attracted people, and two, the uptake of support services when they are desired. We now turn to methods of addressing and reducing the stigma.